Hey friend, welcome back. Make sure you subscribe for daily interesting history videos like this. Imagine waking up in the 1950s as a housewife and discovering that almost everything expected of you would seem completely strange. Today there were rules about how you should dress, how you should speak, how you should behave around your husband, how you should keep your house, and even how you were supposed to spend your free time. Some of these habits were ordinary parts of everyday life, yet millions of women followed them because they were considered normal, respectable, and simply part of being a good wife. The 1950s are often remembered through cheerful photographs of smiling families, spotless kitchens, freshly baked pies, and perfectly dressed mothers standing beside gleaming refrigerators. Advertisements from the period created an image of domestic life that looked almost effortless. But behind that polished picture was a complicated set of expectations. A housewife was not simply someone who stayed at home. She was expected to be the cook, cleaner, organizer, nurse, decorator, hostess, child, care provider, and emotional center of the entire household. And many of the things she did every day would look surprisingly unusual to someone living in the 21st century. One of the strangest expectations was that a woman should often dress properly even when she had absolutely nowhere to go. Staying home did not necessarily mean staying in pajamas or wearing whatever was comfortable. A housewife might change into a daytime dress, fix her hair, put on makeup, and make herself presentable before beginning her household chores. Looking neat was considered part of. If the doorbell rang unexpectedly, she was supposed to be ready to greet a neighbor, delivery worker, or visitor without looking as though she had just rolled out of bed. This idea was reinforced constantly by magazines and advertisements. Women were shown wearing dresses and aprons while cooking, cleaning, or preparing meals. The message was subtle, but powerful. A respectable woman maintained her appearance because her appearance reflected the quality of her home and, in some ways, the success of her husband. Even an ordinary Tuesday morning could become a small performance of domestic perfection. Another unusual habit was the importance placed on having the house ready for unexpected visitors. Today, someone might send a message before dropping by. In the 1950s, people could simply appear at your front door. A neighbor might stop for coffee, a relative might arrive unexpectedly, or your husband's colleague might come over. The house was therefore expected to look presentable at almost any moment. This meant that cleaning was not simply something done once a week. Many women were constantly maintaining the appearance of the home. Cushions had to be arranged. Dishes had to be washed, floors had to be clean, curtains had to look fresh, and surfaces had to be free of dust. A messy living room was not merely considered untidy. It could be interpreted as evidence that the housewife was not doing her job properly. And then there was the kitchen. The kitchen was practically the command center of the 1950s household. A woman was expected to know how to prepare meals, plan menus, preserve food, bake, and make use of whatever ingredients were available. Convenience foods were becoming increasingly popular, but cooking from scratch was still strongly associated with being a good wife and mother. Dinner was often treated as an important daily event rather than simply something to eat whenever everyone happened to be hungry. The husband might return home from work at a predictable time, and the family was expected to gather around the table. The housewife's responsibility was to have everything ready. In many homes, serving dinner was almost a scheduled production. Even more interesting was the expectation that the husband should not necessarily see the messy preparation behind the meal. The ideal was to create the impression that dinner appeared almost magically. The house was clean, the children were ready, and the food was waiting. The work required to make all of this happen was largely invisible. Some women even planned meals days in advance. They might consider what was affordable, what ingredients were already in the pantry, what leftovers could be reused, and what meals their families preferred. Grocery shopping itself could become a major part of the weekly routine. Without modern online shopping, women physically visited stores, carried groceries home, stored them, and carefully managed household supplies. Another thing that feels strange today was the way women were often encouraged to treat their husbands almost like guests in their own homes. A wife might be expected to greet her husband warmly when he returned from work, take his coat, prepare his meal, and give him time to relax. Some advice literature even suggested that wives should avoid immediately discussing household problems or difficult subjects when their husbands arrived home. The husband had supposedly spent the day dealing with the stresses of work, while the wife had been waiting at home. The expectation was that the home should function as his place of comfort. That meant a housewife was sometimes encouraged to hide her own frustrations until a more appropriate moment. This also affected the way couples communicated. A woman was often expected to be agreeable, supportive, and careful not to challenge her husband's authority too openly. Of course, real marriages were far more complicated than these stereotypes suggest, and many women certainly did not behave according to every magazine recommendation. But the cultural ideal was clear. The husband was generally presented as the head of the household, while the wife was expected to support him. Perhaps one of the most surprising aspects of the period was how much household technology was marketed, specifically as a way to make women better housewives. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, electric mixers, automatic ovens, and other appliances were advertised as symbols of modern convenience. Yet these machines did not necessarily eliminate domestic work. Instead, they sometimes raised expectations about how clean and organized a home should be. If a vacuum cleaner made cleaning easier, perhaps the carpets could be vacuumed more often. If a washing machine simplified laundry, perhaps clothes could be washed more frequently. Technology saved time in some areas while creating new standards in others. Laundry itself could be a huge undertaking. Families had fewer disposable clothing options, and many garments required careful washing, ironing, folding, and storage. Ironing was especially important. Shirts, dresses, pillowcases, tablecloths, and other household fabrics were expected to look crisp. A wrinkled shirt could be considered evidence of poor housekeeping. And then there was the mysterious world of ironing almost everything. Today, many people barely iron clothes, unless they are going somewhere important. In the 1950s, ironing was much more deeply embedded in domestic routines. Women could spend significant amounts of time making sure clothing and household fabrics looked perfectly pressed. The ironing board could become a permanent part of the weekly household routine. Children also contributed to the workload. Mothers were expected to monitor their children's behavior, clothing, schoolwork, meals, manners, and appearance. A child's behavior could reflect directly on the mother. If a child was poorly behaved in public, people might blame the parents, and particularly the mother teaching children proper manners was therefore considered extremely important. Saying please and thank you, sitting properly at the table, greeting adults respectfully, and avoiding certain kinds of behavior were all part of raising a respectable child. Children themselves also lived under a very different set of expectations. They were often given considerably more freedom to play outside without constant adult supervision. A child might leave the house after breakfast, ride a bicycle around the neighborhood, play with friends, and return home later in the day. Parents generally had fewer ways to track their children's location because there were no smartphones, location sharing apps, or instant messaging. For the housewife, this could mean long periods of uncertainty about exactly where her children were. She might simply trust that they would return home when they were supposed to. Another strange part of domestic life was the importance of entertaining guests. Hosting people at home was a social skill. Women were expected to know how to arrange the living room, prepare refreshments, set a proper table, and keep conversation flowing. Coffee, tea, sandwiches, cakes, cookies, or other small foods could be served when visitors arrived. The hostess was expected to make everything appear effortless. If something went wrong in the kitchen, guests ideally should never notice. If the house was messy, they should not see it. If the children were being difficult, the mother was expected to manage the situation quietly. There was also a strong emphasis on using the right dishes and serving pieces. A family might have everyday plates and special dishes reserved for guests or important occasions. Certain foods were associated with entertaining, and presentation mattered considerably. The dining table itself could become a stage for domestic competence. Napkins, silverware, glasses, plates, serving dishes and centerpieces were arranged according to social expectations. A woman who knew how to set an attractive table could be considered an excellent hostess. Then there was the strange relationship many people had with the telephone. The telephone was becoming increasingly common, but it was still a household object rather than a personal device. There were also countless small rules surrounding personal behavior that might seem almost unbelievable today. A housewife was often expected to know when to speak, when to remain quiet, when to offer help, and when to step back. Social etiquette was taken seriously, especially when guests were present. The way a woman carried herself could influence how people viewed her family, her marriage, and even her character. For example, casual clothing was not always considered appropriate outside the house. A woman going shopping might still take time to fix her hair, put on a proper dress, and make herself presentable. Going to the grocery store was not necessarily treated as a completely private activity. You could run into neighbors, acquaintances, or friends, and looking untidy could become a source of embarrassment. Shopping itself was a very different experience. There were no online grocery deliveries, no one-click purchases, and no smartphones reminding you that you had forgotten the milk. A housewife had to remember what the family needed. She might keep a handwritten list and visit several stores to find the best prices. She had to carry the groceries home or arrange transportation, then organize everything in the kitchen. Even the refrigerator had its own rules. Food was carefully stored because wasting it meant wasting money. Leftovers were often saved, labeled mentally or physically, and transformed into another meal. The idea of simply ordering something from a restaurant because nobody felt like cooking was far less common for ordinary families. Eating outside the home was generally more of an occasion. Restaurants existed, of course, but regular restaurant meals were not necessarily part of everyday family life. The home kitchen remained the center of food preparation. Breakfast could involve several separate tasks before the day had properly begun. Coffee needed to be prepared. Eggs might need cooking. Toast had to be made. Children needed to be fed and dressed. Lunches might have to be packed. Dishes had to be cleared away. And after everyone left for school or work, the housewife's own workday was just beginning. One of the strangest things to understand today is that many household chores were repeated because the standard of cleanliness was extremely high. Floors were swept or vacuumed frequently. Beds were made every morning. Bathrooms needed regular cleaning. Kitchen surfaces were wiped down repeatedly. Dust was considered a constant enemy. Dusting could become a daily ritual. A woman might walk through the living room with a cloth wiping furniture, shelves, picture frames, and other surfaces. If sunlight entered through the windows, every particle of dust seemed visible. A clean home was not simply preferred. It was a visible sign of discipline. Windows could also require significant effort. Without the specialized cleaning products and equipment people have today, many household cleaning tasks were more physically demanding. The housewife's body was often part of the machinery that kept the home functioning. And then came the floors. Carpets had to be vacuumed. Wooden floors might be swept and polished. Linoleum needed cleaning. Kitchen floors could require scrubbing. A spotless floor was one of those details visitors might not consciously notice, but a dirty one could immediately attract criticism. The same applied to bathrooms. Modern cleaning technology has changed dramatically, but maintaining a bathroom in the 1950s still required regular physical effort. A housewife could spend considerable time scrubbing sinks, tubs, toilets, tiles, and floors. There was also an expectation that the house should smell clean. This is an interesting detail because smell was an important part of domestic presentation. Freshly washed clothes, clean floors, baked food, polished furniture, and open windows could create the impression of a healthy, well-maintained home. Unpleasant smells were something a good housewife was expected to eliminate quickly. Cooking aromas were especially important. The smell of bread, cake, coffee, roast meat, or a freshly prepared meal could make a home feel welcoming. Advertisements often used these associations to connect food products with family happiness. The kitchen itself was becoming increasingly modern. Bright refrigerators, colourful appliances, new countertops, and improved cooking equipment promised a better future. Yet the woman operating these machines remained responsible for producing the final result. An electric mixer might save time, but someone still had to measure the ingredients. A refrigerator could preserve food, but someone had to plan what food to buy. A washing machine could wash clothes, but someone still had to sort, load, hang, fold, and iron them. Modern appliances changed the process without necessarily changing the expectation. Another unusual aspect of the period was the popularity of home economics as a source of practical education for girls. Young women could learn cooking, sewing, budgeting, nutrition, household management, and other domestic skills. These were not necessarily treated as hobbies. They were considered essential preparation for adult life. A teenage girl might be taught how to prepare a family meal or sew a garment, because these were seen as important skills she would need after marriage. The assumption behind this education was straightforward. Eventually, she would have a household of her own. That expectation could influence almost every stage of a young woman's life. Dating itself was often viewed through the lens of marriage. A serious relationship was expected to lead somewhere. A young woman was not necessarily encouraged to think of relationships purely as personal experiences. Compatibility, family background, reputation, financial stability, and future prospects could all matter. Marriage was also heavily idealized. Once married, a woman could find that her life became centered around the household almost immediately. If children arrived, her responsibilities expanded even further. Child care in particular was demanding because there were far fewer conveniences that modern parents take for granted. Disposable diapers were available by the end of the decade, but had not yet transformed everyday parenting to the extent they eventually would. Cloth diapers meant washing, drying, folding, and repeating the process constantly. Baby clothes also required regular cleaning. Bottles had to be washed and sterilized. Meals had to be prepared manually. There were no digital baby monitors, smart cameras, or parenting apps. And yet families managed. They relied on routines, relatives, neighbors, and community networks. Neighbors were often much more involved in each other's lives. A woman might know who lived several houses away, who had children, who was expecting a baby, who was sick, and who had recently moved into the neighborhood. The local community could function almost like an informal information network. This could be comforting, but it could also create pressure. When everyone knows everyone, privacy becomes difficult. A woman could feel that her behavior was constantly visible. If her house looked neglected, neighbors might notice. If her children behaved badly, someone might mention it. If she stopped attending social gatherings, people might wonder why reputation mattered. Women were therefore often expected to maintain friendly relationships with neighbours while avoiding behaviour that could be considered inappropriate or overly independent. The concept of being a good neighbour had real social importance. Borrowing a cup of sugar was not simply a movie cliché. Neighbours could genuinely exchange household items, recipes, advice and favours. If someone became ill, neighbours might bring food. If a woman had a baby, friends might help with meals or children. These relationships helped make domestic life manageable. But another strange part of the era was the expectation that women should be capable of making many things themselves. Homemade jam, cakes, preserves, clothing repairs, decorations, and even certain household products could be part of domestic life. The modern concept of convenience was still developing. If you wanted something, you could not always simply buy the finished version. Making, repairing, adapting, and reusing were ordinary skills. This created a culture of resourcefulness. A torn dress could be repaired. A leftover meal could become tomorrow's lunch. An old piece of fabric could become something useful, or an item might be polished, patched, or repurposed rather than immediately replaced. The housewife was expected to know how to solve problems using whatever was available. Even cleaning products were often used in surprisingly creative ways. Household guides provided recipes and recommendations for dealing with stains, odours, grease, and difficult surfaces. Women were expected to know which method worked for which problem. A stain on a child's shirt was not simply an inconvenience. It was a challenge to be solved. And there was another invisible responsibility, keeping track of everything: appointments, school, schedules, grocery needs, household bills, birthdays, family events, clothing sizes, medical appointments, social invitations, meals, laundry, cleaning. The housewife often served as the family's unofficial information manager. She knew where things were. She knew what needed to be purchased. She knew when the children had school events. She knew which relative had a birthday coming up. She knew when the husband needed a clean shirt. This organizational work was rarely described as a professional skill, even though it required planning, memory, and constant attention. The irony is that many of these skills would be highly valued in modern workplaces. There were also strange little rituals surrounding the way a housewife prepared for the end of the day. Evening was not simply the moment when everyone stopped working. It was another carefully managed part of the household routine. Dinner had to be finished, dishes had to be cleared, leftovers stored, children prepared for bed, clothing arranged for the following morning, and the house restored to a reasonable state before anyone could truly relax. For the housewife, this could mean that the family dinner was actually the middle of her evening rather than the end of her work. Everyone else might finish eating and move toward the living room, but she still had dishes to wash, food to put away, counters to clean, and pans to scrub. If there were several children, the amount of cleanup could be considerable. The family might sit comfortably around the television while she moved back and forth between the kitchen and the living room. That contrast is easy to miss. The family was relaxing because someone was still working. And this happened so frequently that it could become almost invisible. Another unusual expectation was the importance of preparing the house for the next morning before going to bed. A smart housewife did not necessarily wait until breakfast to discover that something was missing. She might check the kitchen, make sure necessary ingredients were available, prepare certain foods ahead of time, and think through the morning schedule. Clothes might be laid out, school items might be gathered, lunch supplies might be organized. The kitchen might be left ready for breakfast. This was domestic forecasting. The goal was to make tomorrow easier by doing some of tomorrow's work tonight. It sounds remarkably modern when described that way, but the motivation was practical. A chaotic morning could disrupt the entire family. If the husband was late for work or the children missed school, the household schedule could fall apart. Preparation prevented problems. And preparation was often the housewife's responsibility. Even small things could require advanced planning. If a child needed a special outfit for school, it could not be discovered at the last moment that the clothing was dirty. If the family planned to attend church on Sunday, clothes needed to be ready. If guests were coming, the guest room needed preparation. The housewife was constantly thinking one step ahead, sometimes several steps ahead. This was especially important because there were fewer ways to solve problems instantly. If you discovered at 9 in the evening that you were missing an ingredient, you could not simply order it from a delivery service. If a shirt was dirty, you could not quickly purchase a replacement online. If you forgot an appointment, there was no phone notification reminding you. If you got lost while driving, there was no digital map guiding you home. Planning mattered because convenience was limited. This created a culture of preparedness. People carried things they might need. Families stored supplies. Women kept emergency household items. Travel involved preparation. Shopping involved lists. Meals involved planning. The household worked because people anticipated problems before they appeared. Another fascinating habit involved saving containers. Glass jars, boxes, tins, and other household containers could have second lives. Throwing away a useful container was not always considered sensible. A jar might become storage for food. A tin could hold sewing materials. A box could store photographs, letters, or small household objects. This practical reuse was partly economic and partly cultural. People were accustomed to finding another purpose for things. The modern idea of disposable packaging was not yet as deeply embedded in everyday life. A housewife could look at an empty container and think, that might be useful. This mindset extended to clothing and furniture. An old shirt could become a cleaning cloth. A worn garment could be altered. Fabric scraps could be used for sewing projects. Old household items could be repurposed. The home itself was a place of improvisation. There was a certain satisfaction in making something useful from something that might otherwise have been thrown away. Another strange routine was the care given to shoes. Shoes were expensive enough that families often wanted them to last. They might be cleaned, polished, repaired, and stored carefully. A child returning from outside with muddy shoes could create another household task. Shoes might need to be removed before entering certain areas. Polishing shoes could be part of preparing for church, school, work, or special occasions. A well-dressed family was expected to have clean shoes. Again, a small detail could communicate respectability. The same applied to men's work clothes. A husband's work shirt could be washed and pressed repeatedly. If he wore a suit, it needed to be maintained. If he worked in an environment where clothes became dirty, the laundry burden increased. The wife was often responsible for managing this cycle. Work clothes came home dirty. They went into the laundry. They were washed. They were dried. They were ironed. They were put away. Then they went back to work. The cycle repeated every week. And if the husband worked 6 days, the household could produce a steady stream of laundry. This is another reason why the image of a housewife sitting quietly at home can be misleading. Her home was constantly producing work. People entered. People left. Clothes became dirty. Food was eaten. Rooms became untidy. Children created messes. Supplies were consumed. The household itself generated an endless list of tasks. The housewife's job was to restore order over and over again. Another interesting feature was the expectation that women should be able to make guests feel comfortable, even if the visit was unexpected. A visitor might arrive without much warning. The housewife could not always say, "Sorry, my house isn't ready." She was expected to welcome the person. This meant keeping certain things prepared. Coffee, tea, cookies, cake perhaps, sandwiches, a clean sitting area, fresh towels if the person stayed, a reasonably tidy bathroom. The ability to entertain unexpectedly was considered part of being a good hostess. This could produce an almost constant low-level pressure to keep the house ready. If the home was always potentially open to visitors, it could never be allowed to become completely chaotic. And this is where the famous idea of the company clean house comes in. Some households had a difference between normal daily cleanliness and the deeper cleaning done before guests arrived. A visitor coming over could trigger a sudden burst of activity. Children were told to put away toys, clothes disappeared into bedrooms, papers were organized, furniture was straightened, the bathroom was checked, the kitchen was cleaned, the living room became the priority. The housewife might accomplish in 20 minutes what she had been postponing for 2 days. Then the doorbell rang. She smiled. The guest entered. And everything looked perfect. The visitor saw the finished product, not the frantic preparation. This pattern of presenting a polished home was deeply connected to social reputation. A home was a public statement. Even though it was technically private, people noticed furniture, they noticed cleanliness, they noticed food, they noticed children, they noticed clothing, and they formed impressions. The housewife could therefore feel that she was being evaluated whenever someone entered her home. This was especially true among women. Friends and neighbors could exchange compliments, recipes, decorating ideas, and household advice. But comparison could also exist beneath the friendliness. Zone woman's kitchen might look newer. Another might have a larger refrigerator. Someone else might have better curtains. Another might host more impressive dinners. Someone might be praised for keeping the cleanest house. The competition was rarely an official competition. Nobody handed out trophies. But social comparison could still be powerful. Advertising made this even stronger. Magazines showed ideal homes. Television showed ideal families. Manufacturers showed ideal kitchens. Women were constantly exposed to images of what they were supposedly missing. If your kitchen was old, perhaps you needed a new appliance. If your living room looked plain, perhaps you needed new furniture. If your clothes looked outdated, perhaps you needed a new dress. If your husband seemed tired, perhaps you needed a better dinner. The message could always be improved, and the consumer economy benefited from this dissatisfaction. The housewife became one of the most important consumers in the post-war economy. She was making decisions about food, cleaning products, clothing, furniture, appliances, and household supplies. Companies therefore learned how to speak directly to her. Advertisements often presented products as solutions to domestic problems. A detergent promised brighter clothes. A cleaner promised a sparkling kitchen. A new appliance promised less effort. A packaged food promised a quicker meal. A beauty product promised a more attractive appearance. The product was not just sold. A better version of domestic life was sold alongside it. This is one reason the 1950s became such an important period in the development of modern consumer culture. The home became a major marketplace, and the housewife was positioned at its center. But there was another strange contradiction. The housewife was encouraged to buy modern products, yet she was also expected to maintain traditional values. She could own a futuristic refrigerator while following old-fashioned rules about marriage. There was another side of this life that becomes especially interesting when we look at the smallest household routines, because some of the things women were expected to do were not simply chores but rituals. The same actions happened so frequently that they became almost automatic. A bed was made because beds were supposed to be made. Shoes were polished because shoes were supposed to look polished. Towels were folded in a particular way because that was simply how a respectable household operated. The ordinary home was full of tiny rules that were rarely questioned. One of those rules concerned the bedroom. A bedroom was not necessarily treated as a casual private space where clothing could be left on the floor and belongings could remain wherever they were dropped. Beds were expected to be made shortly after waking. Sheets were straightened, blankets arranged, pillows positioned, and the room put back into order. A messy bed could make the entire room appear untidy. For a housewife, making the beds could be one of the first household tasks of the morning. If the family had several children, this could mean several beds, several bedrooms, and several sets of blankets. During colder weather, heavier bedding made the task even more physical. And then there was the matter of airing out rooms. Opening windows allowed fresh air into the house and helped reduce stale odors. Bedrooms could be aired after sleeping, particularly in homes without modern climate. The simple act of opening windows was part of maintaining a healthy and pleasant home. Fresh air itself was considered valuable. Sunlight was welcomed. Curtains were opened during the day. Windows were cleaned so that rooms would feel brighter. The house was meant to feel fresh and cheerful. But maintaining those windows was another task. Glass had to be cleaned. Frames had to be wiped. Curtains had to be washed. Screens had to be maintained. A beautiful view outside did not remain beautiful through dirty glass. This was another example of how maintaining a home required attention to details that visitors rarely noticed. Even the way towels were handled could become part of household organization. Towels had to be washed, dried, folded, and stored. Families often had separate towels for different purposes, and keeping them organized required regular attention. The bathroom itself was expected to be clean enough that guests could use it without the family feeling embarrassed. This meant the housewife often had to think about the bathroom, not only as a functional space, but as a representation of the household. A clean sink, a clean mirror, fresh towels, a tidy shelf, everything communicated something. And this concern with appearance extended into the kitchen. Kitchen counters were not supposed to remain cluttered. Dishes were not supposed to pile up indefinitely. Pots and pans were expected to be cleaned soon after use. Food scraps needed to be disposed of. The stove needed attention. A kitchen could become dirty very quickly, especially after preparing a large meal. The housewife was therefore constantly restoring the room to its original condition. Cook, clean, cook again, clean again. The cycle had no final ending. Even after the family went to sleep, the kitchen might still contain evidence of the day's activities. A woman could decide whether to clean everything immediately or leave some work for the morning. But eventually, it all had to be done. The same was true of laundry. Laundry was not a single weekly task for every family. Depending on family size and clothing habits, washing could happen frequently. Children created additional loads, and household linens added even more. The laundry area could become one of the busiest parts of the home. Clothes had to be sorted. White garments might be separated from coloured ones. Delicate fabrics required special care. Stains had to be treated. Clothes were washed, then dried, then folded, then ironed, then stored. A single shirt could pass through an entire chain of work before it was ready to be worn again. And if the shirt belonged to a child who immediately spilled something on it, the process could begin again. This repetitive cycle is one of the clearest examples of why domestic work could consume so much time. The work was not difficult because each individual task was extraordinary. It was difficult because there were so many tasks, zone after another, every day. And often several. While laundry was drying, dinner needed preparation. While dinner was cooking, children needed attention. While children were doing homework, the telephone might ring. While someone was on the telephone, the oven timer could sound. The household was full of interruptions. The housewife had to switch between tasks constantly. Today, we might call this multitasking. At the time, it was simply everyday life. Another fascinating difference involved household shopping. A trip to the grocery store could be a serious part of the day rather than a quick stop on the way home from work. The housewife might need to plan transportation, prepare a list, visit the store, compare prices, purchase everything, carry or transport it home, and then put it all away. If the family had a garden, she might also need to manage fresh produce. If the household kept certain foods in storage, she had to monitor supplies. If there were children, she had to consider what they would eat. Shopping was therefore connected directly to meal planning. A grocery store visit was not simply about buying ingredients. It was about designing the family's meals for the coming days. A woman might look at what was on sale and adjust her menu accordingly. If meat was expensive, she might choose another protein. If vegetables were inexpensive, she might buy more. If fruit was in season, she could incorporate it into desserts or preserves. Budgeting and cooking were closely connected. The ability to turn limited ingredients into satisfying meals was an important domestic skill. And food was not only expected to be affordable, it was supposed to be attractive. A meal should look appetizing. A table should look inviting. A dessert should look special. Presentation mattered because meals were part of family life and hospitality. A woman who served attractive food could receive genuine praise, but praise could also reinforce the expectation that she should continue producing it. The better she became at cooking, the more people might expect from her. A family might say, "She makes the best pie." That compliment sounds harmless. But imagine being the person who now feels obligated to make that pie every holiday. Tradition can be comforting. Tradition can also create work. This is especially obvious during holidays. Certain dishes became associated with particular family members: grandmother's recipe, mother's cake, aunt's cookies. The dish that had to appear at Thanksgiving, the dessert that everyone expected at Christmas, the recipe that could not be changed. These traditions helped families maintain continuity, but they also placed responsibility on the person preparing them. A holiday could be emotionally meaningful and physically exhausting at the same time. The kitchen could become crowded with dishes. The dining room could become full of people. Children could become excited and difficult to control. Guests could stay longer than expected, and after everyone left, the housewife might still be cleaning long after the others had gone to bed. Another forgotten part of the era was the importance of household silence during certain moments. When adults were speaking, children might be expected to remain quiet. During radio programs or television shows, family members could be asked not to interrupt. The household could have its own rules about when conversation was appropriate. Children were often taught that adults needed privacy. This is particularly interesting because modern families may have a more informal relationship between adults and children. In many 1950s households, age hierarchy was more visible. Older people were given greater authority. Children were expected to listen. Young people were expected to respect adults. A housewife often enforced these boundaries. She taught children when to speak, how to speak, and how to behave. She was preparing them for a society where manners were highly valued. Even the way children addressed adults could be more formal. Certain adults might be addressed by titles rather than first names. This reinforced the idea that relationships had social structure. Another interesting household ritual involved preparing children for bed. Bathing, pajamas, brushing teeth, bedtime stories, prayers in some families, and lights. Out could form a predictable sequence. The mother might check that everyone had what they needed. She could then finally have a quiet moment, but even after children were asleep, household responsibilities might continue. The kitchen needed attention. Clothes might need folding, tomorrow's breakfast might need planning, the next day's clothing might need preparation, a school bag might need checking, a household bill might need attention. The day did not necessarily end when the children went to bed. This is why the concept of staying home can be misleading. A housewife could be physically at home for the entire day while working almost continuously. Being at home did not mean being free. The home was where the work happened, and because there was no physical separation between workplace and personal life, the boundaries could disappear completely. Imagine having your office inside your home, but being expected to answer every family request immediately. That was the reality for many women. There was no closing the office door. And there were still countless little routines that made everyday life in a 1950s household feel like a completely different world. Some were so ordinary at the time that nobody would have thought of them as unusual. They were simply part of the rhythm of being married, raising children, and maintaining a home. But when viewed from the present, those routines revealed just how much responsibility was placed on the person running the household. One example was the way mornings were organized. The family often moved through the morning according to a predictable sequence. Someone woke up, the kitchen became active, breakfast was prepared, children were dressed, lunches were packed, and the husband prepared for work. The housewife was often moving between several tasks at once. She might be watching something on the stove while helping a child find a missing shoe, and remembering that another child needed a school form signed. There was no digital calendar flashing reminders on a screen. There was no family group chat where everyone could ask what was happening. The household depended heavily on memory. A mother might know exactly what time the school bus came, what time her husband usually arrived home, which day groceries were purchased, when laundry was normally done, and which evening belonged to a particular family activity. If she forgot, the consequences could affect everyone. This made memory an important domestic skill. The housewife often carried an enormous amount of information in her head. She knew what food was available. She knew which clothes needed washing. She knew which child needed new shoes. She knew which bill needed attention. She knew when relatives were visiting. She knew what was happening at school. She knew which household items were running low. She knew what dinner was supposed to be, and often everyone else simply assumed she knew. This is one reason why domestic work could be mentally exhausting even when the physical tasks seemed ordinary. The work was not only doing things, it was remembering things before they needed to be done. That meant thinking ahead constantly. If guests were coming on Saturday, preparations might begin on Wednesday. If a special meal was planned, ingredients had to be purchased beforehand. If clothes needed to be worn on Sunday, they had to be washed and pressed before then. If a child had an event at school, the appropriate clothing needed to be ready. The household was essentially a continuous planning exercise, and the person managing it often did so without recognition. Another curious aspect was the importance of making children look presentable before leaving the house. A mother could spend considerable time checking collars, buttons, hair, shoes, and clothing. Children were not necessarily expected to decide their own outfits or appearance. The mother's judgment mattered. If a child looked untidy, people might assume the mother was not paying attention. This could create enormous pressure because children naturally did not always cooperate. A boy might refuse to wear the shirt his mother selected. A girl might get her dress dirty moments before leaving. A child might lose a shoe. Simone might spill breakfast. The carefully planned morning could fall apart in seconds. And yet, the family was still expected to arrive on time. The mother had to solve the problem. This is another reason why the seemingly perfect family photographs of the era should be viewed carefully. They show the final result, not the chaos that may have happened just before the camera was turned on. The same was true of school photographs. The children appeared neatly dressed and perfectly groomed. Someone had prepared them. Someone had cleaned their shoes. Someone had fixed their hair. Someone had made sure their clothes were properly pressed. Someone had probably reminded them not to get dirty before the photograph. That someone was very often the mother. There was also an expectation that children should respect household objects. Furniture was not something they were encouraged to climb on. Walls were not places to draw. Good dishes were not toys. Certain rooms were off. Limits during particular occasions. Children were taught that the home belonged to everyone, but it also had rules. A mother could spend a large portion of the day enforcing those rules. Don't touch that. Put that away. Close the door. Take off your shoes. Sit properly. Finish your food. Don't interrupt. Be quiet. Clean your room. These instructions sound familiar, but the level of formality surrounding children's behavior could be much stronger. Children were often expected to understand that adults had authority and that questioning every instruction was not necessarily acceptable. Good manners were not optional decorations. They were part of raising a respectable child. A child who greeted adults politely could make the parents proud. A child who behaved badly could embarrass the entire family. The mother's role in teaching those manners could therefore feel almost like a public responsibility. Even family vacations involved substantial planning. A road trip in the 1950s might require maps, printed directions, packed food, clothing, luggage, and careful preparation of the automobile. There was no GPS announcing the next turn. If the family got lost, someone had to figure out where they were. The housewife might prepare sandwiches and snacks for the journey, because stopping frequently at restaurants could be expensive. She might pack games, books, clothing, towels, and other supplies for the children. And because there were no smartphones to occupy children for hours, parents had to think about how to keep them entertained. A long car ride could involve songs, games, arguments between siblings, questions about how much longer remained, and repeated requests for snacks. The mother was often the person trying to keep everyone comfortable. A family vacation was supposed to be relaxing. Preparing for it was anything but relaxing. The same was true of returning home. The suitcases had to be unpacked. Dirty clothes needed washing. Souvenirs had to be organized. The house had to be restored to normal. A vacation did not eliminate domestic work. It simply postponed some of it. Another interesting feature of the period was the way women were expected to maintain a certain appearance, even during physically demanding household work. The ideal housewife could be shown wearing a dress, neatly styled hair, makeup, and an attractive apron while cooking or cleaning. Real life was undoubtedly messier. Sweat, stains, spills, tiredness, and bad hair days existed. Then, just as they do now, but advertising rarely showed them. The commercial version of domestic life was almost always cheerful. The woman smiled while cleaning. She smiled while cooking. She smiled while doing laundry. She smiled while serving her family. The message was that domestic work was satisfying. The advertisements rarely showed the moment when a woman finally sat down after hours of work because her feet hurt. They rarely showed the sink full of dishes. They rarely showed the laundry basket that somehow became full again. They rarely showed the child who refused to sleep. The idealized image depended on leaving those moments outside the frame. This created a powerful cultural expectation. A woman was not only supposed to perform the work, she was supposed to appear happy while doing it. That distinction could be exhausting. Another part of the 1950s household was the careful management of food portions. Waste was discouraged, but so was careless spending. A housewife needed to know how much food her family actually consumed. Cooking too little could leave people hungry. Cooking too much could create waste. The solution was experience. Over time, she learned how much rice, meat, vegetables, bread, or dessert was needed for the family. She could look at a group of people and estimate how much food would be required. This knowledge was rarely written down. It was learned through repetition. The same happened with grocery shopping. A woman could walk through a store and mentally calculate whether a particular item was worth buying. She might compare brands, look for sales, use coupons, decide whether a cheaper alternative would work. She was effectively managing a small supply chain from the grocery store to the family's kitchen. And because storage space was limited compared with modern supermarkets and giant refrigerators, she had to think carefully about what could be stored and for how long food preservation mattered. Canning, pickling, freezing, drying, and other techniques allowed families to extend the life of food. These skills were particularly useful for households with gardens. A large harvest could become a major project. Instead of allowing vegetables or fruits to spoil, the family could preserve them for later. The kitchen became a place where the seasons were captured and stored. A jar of preserved food could represent summer months later in the year. This was more than cooking. It was household resource management, and women often became experts at it. Another domestic skill that was common was knowing how to deal with stains. A stain on a garment could be treated quickly, using whatever methods were available. Different stains required different approaches: grease, ink, grass, food, mud, coffee. Each presented a problem. A housewife could have a collection of household advice for dealing with them. The goal was always the same: save the garment. Throwing something away because of one stain was often considered wasteful. The ability to restore an item was therefore valuable. This culture of repair extended beyond clothing. Household objects were maintained rather than immediately replaced, and the routines could become even more demanding when the seasons changed. A 1950s housewife did not simply manage the same household routine throughout the year. Each season brought its own work, its own preparations, and its own expectations. Summer meant different foods, different clothing, more outdoor activities, and often more laundry. Winter meant heavier clothing, colder rooms, additional heating concerns, and different household routines. Spring could mean an enormous cleaning project, while autumn brought preparation for colder weather and the holiday season. Spring cleaning was one of the most recognizable traditions. It was not simply opening a window and wiping a few surfaces. For many households, spring represented an opportunity to clean areas that had been neglected during the winter months. Curtains could be washed, windows cleaned, furniture moved, carpets beaten or vacuumed thoroughly, cupboards reorganized, and closets sorted. The entire house could be turned upside down before being carefully put back together. A woman could spend days working through rooms that normally looked perfectly clean. Furniture might be moved away from walls, drawers might be emptied, closets might be reorganized. Old clothing might be repaired, donated, or stored. Dust that had accumulated in hidden corners had to be removed. It was almost like restarting the household for a new season. And because the home was often regarded as a reflection of the woman managing it, spring cleaning could carry a sense of obligation rather than simply being a practical activity. A thoroughly cleaned home was something to be proud of. The arrival of summer created a different challenge. Without modern air conditioning in most homes, families had to rely on windows, fans, shade, and changes in daily routine to deal with heat. Kitchens could become particularly uncomfortable because cooking produced additional heat. Imagine preparing a large family dinner on a hot summer afternoon while standing beside a stove with no modern climate control. The heat from the oven could make the kitchen one of the warmest rooms in the house. Cold foods, salads, sandwiches, fruit, and other lighter meals could therefore become especially attractive. Outdoor cooking and barbecues also became increasingly popular. turning food preparation into a social activity. But even a family barbecue involved preparation, serving, cleaning, and organizing afterward. The housewife's work simply moved outdoors. Summer also meant more children at home because school was out. That could completely change the household rhythm. During the school year, children had a schedule. During summer, they might spend much more time at home or outside with friends. The mother might suddenly have several children asking for food throughout the day. Breakfast, a snack, lunch, another snack, dinner, and the kitchen could feel as though it never closed. Children were also more likely to bring dirt into the house after playing outdoors. Shoes, bicycles, grass, mud, and outdoor toys created additional cleaning. A mother could clean a floor in the morning and find it dirty again by afternoon. This was simply part of family life. Then came autumn, which meant preparing for school. Clothing needed to be checked. Shoes had to fit. School supplies had to be purchased. Lunch routines had to be reorganized. Children needed to return to a regular schedule. For the mother, the end of summer could mean a return to structured household routines. And then there were holidays. The holiday season could transform the home into a production center. Decorations had to be arranged. Special meals had to be planned. Gifts had to be purchased. Cards had to be written. Guests might arrive. Relatives might stay overnight. Children needed to be prepared. And the house had to look festive. Christmas in particular could create an enormous amount of domestic work. Baking could begin weeks in advance. Cookies, pies, cakes, candies, breads, and other foods could be prepared and stored. A woman might have recipes specifically reserved for the holiday season. Some were family traditions passed down through generations. The kitchen could remain busy for hours, and after all the cooking came the cleaning. A large holiday meal could create an enormous pile of dishes. The family remembered the delicious food. The housewife remembered the sink. This pattern repeated across every major family occasion. The people who enjoyed the celebration often experienced the finished event. The person organizing it experienced the process. That does not mean women did not enjoy preparing these events. Many did. Cooking for relatives, decorating traditions could be deeply meaningful, but it was still work. Another surprising expectation was that the housewife should often be prepared to accommodate other people's schedules. A husband might bring a colleague home unexpectedly, relatives might visit, children might have friends over, a neighbor might stop by. The household therefore had to remain flexible. A woman could not always plan her day with complete certainty. Her routine could be interrupted by other people's needs. A child might come home from school early. Someone could become sick. The husband might arrive home with a guest. A neighbor might ask for help. A family member might need transportation. The housewife had to adjust. This made household management a form of constant improvisation. She might have a plan for the day, but the plan could change several times before lunchtime. And because the home was considered her primary responsibility, she was often expected to absorb those interruptions without allowing them to disrupt the family's overall routine. There was another unusual feature of the era: the distinction between indoor and outdoor clothing. Shoes could be removed before entering certain parts of the house. Children might have designated play clothes. Good clothes were protected from dirt and stains. Special outfits were reserved for church, parties, visits, or formal occasions. Clothing had value because it was expensive relative to many household budgets. A child was therefore expected to take care of their clothes. Getting a good dress dirty could be a genuine problem. A boy returning home with grass stains on his trousers might receive a lecture. A spilled drink on a carefully pressed dress could mean another round of laundry. This created a culture in which clothing was handled carefully. People did not necessarily own enormous wardrobes. Instead, they maintained what they had. Clothes were washed, pressed, repaired, and reused. The idea of buying something new simply because a slightly different style had appeared was less practical for many families. Fashion still mattered enormously, but maintaining clothing mattered too. A housewife could therefore become skilled at making older garments look presentable. A small alteration could change the appearance of a dress. A new button could refresh a coat. A carefully repaired seam could extend the life of a garment. This was domestic craftsmanship, and it required patience. The same patience applied to household furniture. Furniture was not always disposable. A scratched table could be polished. A chair could be repaired. Wood could be refinished. Upholstery could be replaced. Objects were expected to last. This made the home less disposable than many modern households. A family might keep the same dining table for decades. A sewing machine could remain in a household for generations. A recipe book could outlive several owners. A piece of furniture might carry family history. The home was therefore filled with objects that had stories. The housewife often served as the person who cared for them. She knew how to maintain them. She knew where they belonged. She knew when they needed repair, and she knew which objects were important. Another strange habit involved the preservation of photographs. Before smartphones and cloud storage, photographs were physical objects. Family pictures were carefully stored in albums, boxes, drawers, or frames. A woman might organize photographs from birthdays, vacations, weddings, school events, and holidays. She could write names and dates on the backs. She might send copies to relatives. Photographs were valuable because they were not endlessly reproducible in everyday life. A family gathering could produce only a handful of photographs. Each one mattered. The housewife often became the informal archivist of the family. She preserved memories. She kept important papers. She stored greeting cards. She saved children's drawings. She might keep newspaper clippings or letters. The home became a physical archive. This is very different from today, when thousands of photographs can exist on a single phone without anyone organizing them. In the 1950s, preserving a memory required physical space, and physical space required organization. The same could be said about music. Records were physical objects that needed to be stored and protected. A family might have a small collection of records, and choosing what to play could become part of an evening routine. There was no infinite library of songs available instantly. People owned music. They cared for it. They played the same records repeatedly. A favorite song could become associated with a particular room, event, or family memory. The housewife could also be responsible for keeping these household possessions organized. Again, the pattern appears. Someone had to know where everything was. Someone had to protect it. Someone had to maintain it. And often that someone was the woman running the household. Another important part of life was the relationship between the home and the automobile. And once you begin looking closely at the ordinary routines of the 1950s, even the smallest details start revealing how different expectations could be. A woman was often expected to know exactly how her household should look at different times of the day. Morning had one appearance, afternoon another, and evening another. The home was not simply cleaned once and forgotten. It was continuously adjusted according to what was happening inside it. After breakfast, the dining table might be cleared and returned to its normal appearance. Chairs were pushed back into place. Crumbs were removed. Dishes disappeared into the kitchen. The room was restored almost as though breakfast had never happened. Later, when lunch was finished, the same process happened again. Then came dinner. The strange part was that the housewife could spend much of her day undoing the evidence of the family's existence. People ate, so she cleaned. People changed clothes, so she washed. People walked through rooms, so she swept. People slept, so she made beds. People played, so she organized. People visited, so she prepared. The family lived normally, and she continuously restored the house afterward. This explains why domestic work could feel endless. The work was not creating something permanent. It was constantly returning the household to a preferred state. A clean kitchen became dirty again. A tidy bedroom became messy again. An empty laundry basket became full again. A stocked refrigerator became empty again. A peaceful room became noisy again. There was always another cycle. And one of the most unusual expectations was that the housewife should somehow remain ahead of that cycle. She was not supposed to wait until everything became chaotic. She was supposed to anticipate the mess and prevent it from becoming visible. This could involve small habits that seem almost excessive today. Cushions were straightened, curtains were adjusted, bedspreads were arranged, tablecloths were smoothed, decorative objects were positioned carefully, furniture was kept in its proper place. The goal was not simply cleanliness. It was order. A well-run household was supposed to look controlled. That sense of order was particularly important when guests were present. A visitor should feel that everything was under control, even if the hostess had been working frantically just before the door opened. Imagine hearing the doorbell while the kitchen is full of dirty dishes. The instinct today might be to say, "Sorry, the house is a mess." But the ideal hostess of the era was expected to welcome the visitor warmly and make the situation look normal. She might quickly hide clutter, straighten the room, adjust her clothing, and invite the guest inside. The visitor saw hospitality. The housewife experienced damage control. Another interesting feature was the way women were expected to know how to serve refreshments without making the guest feel as though they were being served a full meal. A coffee visit might require just the right amount of food. Too little could appear unfriendly. Too much could seem excessive. The hostess had to understand these social signals. A tray might contain coffee, cream, sugar, small cakes, cookies, or sandwiches. Cups and saucers were arranged carefully. Napkins might be provided. Everything was presented attractively. Even serving coffee could be a form of social performance. And after the guest left, the tray had to be cleared, dishes washed, food stored, and the room restored. The visit ended, the work continued. Another surprisingly formal aspect of life involved the way people received telephone calls. The telephone was not simply a personal communication device. It belonged to the household when it rang. Anyone nearby might answer. A housewife could become the family's telephone operator without ever having that title. She answered the call, identified the caller, located the family member being requested, took messages, passed information along. Sometimes she had to explain that someone was not home. If the call concerned a child, school, doctor, relative, or family matter, she might become the first person to hear the information. The telephone therefore became another part of her information management role, and because long-distance calls could be expensive, conversations might be shorter and more deliberate. Calling relatives in another city was not necessarily something people did casually every day. A long-distance conversation could feel like an event. People waited for certain calls. They planned what they wanted to say. They might gather around the telephone. The modern idea of being constantly connected simply didn't. There was also no expectation that someone could always be reached immediately. If a person left the house, they were simply unavailable. There was no message notification appearing instantly. This meant that household schedules were more dependent on physical presence. If the husband was late, the family might simply wait. If a friend did not answer the phone, you tried again later. If a relative was traveling, you might not hear from them for days. For the housewife, This meant more uncertainty, but also less constant digital interruption. Another strange thing was how much physical paper could accumulate inside a household. Newspapers, magazines, advertisements, letters, bills, school, notices, recipes, coupons, catalogues, and handwritten notes could all pass through the home. Someone had to sort them. Important documents needed to be kept. Unnecessary papers needed to be discarded. Coupons might be saved, recipes might be clipped, letters might be stored. Bills needed attention. The housewife could become the household's paper manager. A small desk or drawer could contain an enormous amount of family information. There might be receipts from stores, medical papers, school documents, insurance information, and correspondence. Keeping track of these things was another invisible administrative task. Today, many of these functions happen electronically. In the 1950s, they happened physically, and physical information takes up space. A family could have boxes filled with old letters and photographs. A drawer could contain years of receipts. A cupboard could contain magazines. A recipe box could grow larger over time. The housewife had to decide what was important enough to keep. This made organization another essential domestic skill. The same applied to clothing storage. Seasonal clothing needed to be rotated. Winter coats could be stored during summer. Summer dresses could be put away during colder months. Children's clothes that no longer fit might be passed to younger siblings. Clothing could be packed into boxes, drawers, closets, or trunks. A mother often knew exactly which child would eventually inherit which garment. Nothing was necessarily wasted. A dress that had become too short for one daughter might become appropriate for another. A coat could pass between siblings. A sweater could be repaired and reused. This was a practical form of household economics. It required planning years ahead, and children growing quickly made the process particularly complicated. A mother had to notice when shoes became too small, when sleeves became too short, and when school clothes needed replacing. Children might not always notice these things themselves. The mother did. Another interesting habit involved polishing and maintaining household surfaces. Wood furniture might need polishing. Silver items might require cleaning. Metal fixtures could be maintained. Shoes could be polished. Appliances needed wiping. The purpose was not simply to make things last. Shiny objects communicated care. A polished dining table suggested a well-maintained home. A clean appliance suggested modernity. A shiny pair of shoes suggested a well-dressed family. Even small surfaces contributed to the overall impression. The housewife was expected to notice these details, and this attention to detail could become exhausting because there was always another surface, another object, another room, another small imperfection. The culture of perfection created an endless list, but it also created genuine pride. A woman could look at a beautifully maintained home and feel that she had accomplished something. She could invite friends inside and feel proud. She could prepare a meal and receive compliments. She could see her children looking clean and well-dressed and feel successful. These moments mattered. Domestic work was not meaningless. It produced visible results. The difficulty was that those results disappeared quickly. The meal was eaten. The floor became dirty. The laundry returned. The celebration ended. The guests left. The house had to be cleaned again. So satisfaction came in brief moments between cycles. Another surprising routine involved preparing food for school lunches. Children often carried food from home, and the mother could be responsible for planning what they would eat. A lunch had to be practical enough to survive the journey to school while still being appealing to the child. Sandwiches, fruit, cookies, drinks, and other foods could be packed. The challenge was making sure the child actually ate what was provided. If a child disliked something, it might come home untouched. The mother then had to figure out what to prepare next time. This was another example of domestic trial and error. She learned what each family member liked. She remembered allergies or dislikes. She adjusted portions. She knew who wanted more dessert and who preferred something else. Over time, she became the person who knew everyone's food preferences almost instinctively. She knew which child would refuse vegetables. She knew what the husband liked for breakfast. And there were still more details of ordinary life that would seem surprisingly strange today. The 1950s home operated according to a rhythm that was much more structured than the casual routines many families follow now. There was often a proper time for breakfast, a proper time for lunch, a proper time for dinner, and a proper time for almost everything in between. The household was expected to run according to a schedule, and the housewife was often the person responsible for keeping that schedule intact. Morning was especially important. Before the rest of the family was fully awake, there could already be a long list of things waiting to be done. Breakfast had to be prepared. The kitchen had to be organized. Beds had to be made. Children had to be dressed, and the day's plans had to be considered. A mother could not simply decide to stay in bed because she was tired. The household depended on her getting up and starting the routine. Breakfast itself could be much more substantial than what many people eat today. Eggs, bacon, toast, cereal, fruit, pancakes, coffee, milk, or other foods could appear on the table. Preparing breakfast for an entire family meant several separate tasks happening almost simultaneously. While one thing was cooking, something else needed to be served, and the dishes from the previous step were already waiting to be cleaned. Once breakfast was finished, the kitchen was not finished with the family. It still had to be cleaned. Plates had to be washed. Pans had to be scrubbed. The table had to be wiped. Food had to be stored. Counters had to be cleaned. The floor might need sweeping. Only after all of that could the housewife move on to the next part of the day, and the same kitchen would soon be needed again for lunch. This repetition was one of the defining features of domestic work. There was no permanent completion. The moment one task ended, another eventually returned. A sink could be empty at 9 in the morning and full again by noon. A laundry basket could be empty after washing and full again a few days later. A clean floor could become dirty simply because the family walked across it. The work regenerated itself. That is something modern people can understand. But the difference was that many household technologies were less advanced, and the cultural expectation for cleanliness was extremely high. The housewife was expected to notice things that other family members might never even see. A fingerprint on a window, dust on a shelf, crumbs under a table, a wrinkle in a tablecloth, a stain on a carpet, a smudge on a mirror. These tiny imperfections could become part of her responsibility. She was often expected to notice them before anyone else did. And there was another expectation that sounds strange today. The home should be visually coordinated. Furniture, curtains, rugs, lamps, dishes, and decorations were often selected to create a particular appearance. The house was supposed to feel harmonious. Home decorating became an important part of consumer culture. Magazines showed women how to arrange furniture. Advertisements promoted new colors. Manufacturers introduced matching kitchen products. Furniture stores offered coordinated sets. The idea of a stylish home became increasingly accessible to ordinary families. But once again, the responsibility for creating that appearance often fell on the woman. She was expected to know what looked good. She was expected to keep it clean. She was expected to make the home feel warm. And she was often expected to do this without spending too much money. That meant the housewife had to balance aesthetics and economics. A new sofa might look beautiful, but could the family afford it? A new appliance might save time, but was it worth the cost? New curtains might improve the living room, but household budgeting was therefore closely connected to decorating decisions. A woman could spend hours comparing prices, looking through catalogues, checking advertisements, or visiting stores. The catalogue itself was an important part of everyday life. Families could browse products from home, and women could imagine how different items might improve their households. The modern idea of online shopping has an obvious ancestor in these catalogues. But the difference was that ordering something required patience. There was no instant delivery. You might place an order and wait. The excitement of receiving a package could therefore be much greater. A new dress, appliance, or household item could feel like a major event, and clothing itself carried many expectations. A housewife was expected to dress appropriately for different situations. Morning clothes, shopping clothes, church clothes, visiting clothes, special occasion clothes, work clothes. The distinctions could be subtle but meaningful. A woman might change her clothing several times during the day, depending on what she was doing. This was partly about practicality and partly about social expectations. Clothing communicated respectability. A woman who looked polished was considered organized. A woman who looked careless might be judged differently. Hair was equally important. Hairstyles could require time and maintenance. Setting hair, arranging curls, brushing, pinning, and maintaining the desired shape could become part of a woman's routine. A quick shower followed by messy hair and casual clothes was not necessarily considered an acceptable appearance for every occasion. Looking good required effort, and effort itself was often invisible. Simone, seeing the finished hairstyle, did not see the time spent creating it. Simone, seeing a pressed dress, did not see the ironing. Simone, seeing a spotless home, did not see the cleaning. Simone, seeing a beautifully prepared dinner, did not see the preparation. The entire culture of domestic perfection depended on invisible labor. Another interesting part of the period was the importance of many women did not simply follow standardized recipes from the internet, because there was no internet. They built personal collections over time. A recipe might come from a mother, another from a neighbor, another from a magazine, another from a cookbook, another from a friend who brought a dish to a gathering. These recipes could be written on cards and stored in boxes or binders. Over decades, a family could build an entire culinary archive. A recipe card might contain handwriting from someone who had died years earlier. It could become a family memory as much as a cooking instruction. And cooking itself could be an expression of identity. A woman might become famous among relatives for a particular pie, cake, casserole, or roast. Family members might request the same dish for birthdays or holidays. These traditions helped create continuity between generations. But even cooking had rules. Certain foods were considered appropriate for particular meals. Certain dishes were associated with particular occasions. A breakfast had a recognizable structure. A lunch had another. Dinner was often the main family meal. Snacks and desserts had their own place. Food was not only about nutrition, it was part of social order. A well-planned meal demonstrated that the household was organized. A badly prepared meal could be interpreted as a domestic failure. This may sound harsh, but the cultural expectations of the period were often surprisingly demanding. A woman was expected to know what her family liked. She was expected to know how much food to prepare. She was expected to avoid wasting money. She was expected to make meals nutritious. She was expected to provide variety. And she was expected to do all of this repeatedly. The family did not stop eating because the housewife was tired. There was always another meal tomorrow. Another responsibility involved keeping children occupied. Modern parents have access to countless forms of entertainment for children. But in the 1950s, children often relied on simple toys, books, outdoor games, bicycles, neighborhood friends, and their imagination. This could actually reduce some of the mother's direct involvement. Children might spend hours outside playing without a parent standing nearby, but mothers still had to manage clothing, meals, school responsibilities, discipline, and safety. The expectation of independence for children could begin quite early. A child might be expected to dress themselves, walk to a friend's house, ride a bicycle around the neighborhood, or play outside for long periods. The mother could trust the neighborhood environment in a way that many parents would find difficult today. There were no location trackers, no text messages, no video calls. If a child said they were going to play outside, the parent often had to trust them. The child was expected to return at an agreed time. This created a very different relationship between parents and children. Children often had more physical freedom, parents had less, and the community played a larger role in keeping an eye on young people. If a child misbehaved, a neighbor might tell the parents. There was a sense that adults collectively watched over the neighborhood. This could be supportive, but it could also create pressure because families knew they were being observed. The housewife's reputation was tied to her children's behavior. If a child was loud, disrespectful, or badly dressed, the mother could be criticized. She was therefore expected to teach discipline constantly. Children were often expected to say hello to adults. They were expected to sit quietly during certain conversations. They were expected to wait their turn. They were expected not to interrupt. And they were expected to understand that adults had their own social space. There was another side of 1950s domestic life that is easy to miss when looking at the polished photographs of the decade. The sheer amount of preparation that went into ordinary family occasions. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners, school events, visits from relatives, and even simple afternoons with neighbors could require days of planning. The housewife was often expected to remember every detail, from what food needed to be purchased to whether there were enough clean towels for overnight guests. A family gathering could begin long before anyone arrived. The house might be cleaned from top to bottom. Furniture would be dusted, floors cleaned, bathrooms checked, and dishes carefully arranged. Food would be prepared in stages so that everything could be served at the appropriate time. Children might be reminded repeatedly to behave themselves. Clothing would be selected, the dining table would be prepared, and the woman responsible for all of it was expected to remain calm. The strange thing is that guests were often supposed to notice the result without noticing the work. If everything went perfectly, the hostess received compliments. If something went wrong, the responsibility could fall back on her. A burned dessert, a stained tablecloth, poorly behaved children, or a messy room could all become sources of embarrassment. This explains why domestic competence was considered such an important part of a woman's identity. A good housewife was expected to anticipate problems before they happened. If rain was expected, she needed to know whether there were enough umbrellas. If guests were staying overnight, she needed to prepare bedding. If children were coming, she needed to have suitable food. If someone had dietary restrictions, she needed to remember them. If a relative arrived unexpectedly, she needed to make the person feel welcome. In other words, hospitality required planning for situations that had not even happened yet. This kind of mental preparation could continue throughout the day. A housewife might be cooking dinner while thinking about tomorrow's grocery shopping, remembering that a child needed new shoes, wondering whether there was enough laundry detergent, and planning what to serve guests later in the week. Her attention was constantly divided, and because these responsibilities were considered part of being a wife and mother, they were rarely described as a workload. They were simply called household duties. Another unusual habit was the emphasis on conserving household resources. Families were encouraged to avoid unnecessary waste, and women were often expected to be especially careful with food, clothing, electricity, and money. Turning off lights mattered. Using leftover food mattered. Repairing clothing mattered. Keeping appliances functioning mattered. A household budget could depend on small decisions made every day. A woman might compare prices between stores, use coupons, plan meals around sales, and avoid buying things the family did not need. There was also a strong culture of repairing, rather than replacing. A broken zipper could be replaced. A loose seam could be sewn. A sock with a hole could be mended. A worn piece of furniture could be repaired. This was partly financial necessity and partly cultural expectation. Throwing something away simply because it had become slightly damaged could be considered wasteful. The sewing basket was therefore an important part of the household. Inside might be needles, thread, buttons, scissors, pins, measuring tape, patches, and other small tools. A woman could use these materials to extend the life of clothing and household fabrics. Sewing was not necessarily considered an unusual skill. It was part of practical domestic knowledge. Many women could alter clothing, repair garments, sew curtains, make children's clothes, or create decorative items for the home. Some even made entire outfits from patterns. Patterns themselves became popular because they allowed families to create fashionable clothing at a lower cost. A dress bought from a store could be expensive. A pattern and fabric could sometimes provide a more affordable alternative. But homemade clothing required time, measuring, cutting, pinning, sewing, fitting, adjusting, ironing, finishing. A single garment could represent hours of work. The result might look simple, but the process was anything but simple, and this was another example of the invisible labor behind the image of the perfect household. The same applied to baking. A homemade cake could look effortless on a dinner table, but someone had measured the ingredients, prepared the batter, monitored the oven, cleaned the utensils, decorated the cake, and washed everything afterward. The cake was the final product. The work disappeared. This pattern repeated everywhere. A clean shirt hid the laundry. A tidy bedroom hid the cleaning. A hot dinner hid the preparation. A smiling child hid the parenting. A welcoming home hid the organization. A balanced budget hid the calculations. The housewife's success was often measured by how little evidence there was of the work itself. The better she managed the household, the more effortless the household appeared. Another part of domestic life that may surprise modern viewers was the importance of Sunday routines. For many families, Sunday was treated differently from the rest of the week. It could involve church, family meals, visiting relatives, dressing more formally, and preparing for the coming week. Sunday dinner could be a significant family event. The meal might be more elaborate than an ordinary weekday dinner, and relatives might gather around the table. For the housewife, however, a special Sunday meal could mean additional work, more cooking, more dishes, more cleaning, more preparation. The family experienced the special occasion. The person preparing it experienced the workload. This did not necessarily mean women disliked these traditions. Many genuinely valued family gatherings and enjoyed preparing meals for people they loved. But enjoyment and effort could exist at the same time. A person can love something and still find it exhausting. That is an important part of understanding domestic history. Another fascinating detail was the way cleanliness was connected to morality. A messy home could sometimes be interpreted as evidence of laziness or poor character. A woman who maintained a clean house was considered disciplined and respectable. This created pressure to keep the home looking good, even when the family was tired or money was limited. A housewife could feel responsible not only for cleanliness, but for creating the emotional atmosphere of the household. If the family was unhappy, she might feel that she had somehow failed. If the children were arguing, she was expected to restore peace. If her husband was stressed, she was expected to provide comfort. If guests felt uncomfortable, she was expected to make conversation. Her role extended far beyond physical chores. She was often expected to manage emotions. This could be one of the most demanding responsibilities of all. The home was supposed to be a refuge from the outside world. The husband went to work. The children went to school. The housewife remained behind, maintaining the environment they returned to. The ideal was that the home should feel peaceful. That meant unpleasant emotions were sometimes hidden or postponed. A woman might be encouraged not to overwhelm her husband with problems immediately after he came home. Instead, she was supposed to give him time to relax. This idea appears repeatedly in period advice literature. The husband had supposedly completed his working day. The wife's work was less visible, so her exhaustion was not always treated as equivalent. She was expected to be available. She was already home, after all. This assumption is one of the clearest differences between the cultural expectations of that era and modern conversations about domestic labor. Today, many people recognize that staying home with children or managing a household is work. In the 1950s, it was often described simply as a woman's role. The distinction mattered. If something was considered a natural responsibility, people were less likely to question how much effort it required. And there was another important element. The housewife was often expected to know how to make do with limited resources. Suppose a recipe called for an ingredient that was unavailable. She adapted. Suppose a child's trousers tore. She repaired them. Suppose unexpected guests arrived. She found something to serve. Suppose money was tight. She adjusted the shopping list. Suppose the family appliance stopped working. She found another way to complete the task. This practical flexibility was a major part of domestic competence. The home was not a fully automated system. It depended on human problem solving. And the person solving many of those problems was the housewife. Even weather could change the entire routine. Rain meant laundry could not be hung outside. Cold weather affected heating costs. Hot weather changed cooking and food storage. Storms could interrupt shopping or transportation. A housewife had to adapt constantly to circumstances. This makes the idea of the simple 1950s lifestyle somewhat misleading. The technology was simpler. The routines were not necessarily simpler. In fact, many tasks required more physical effort because modern conveniences were either unavailable or less advanced. Laundry provides the clearest example. Today, a person can place clothes into a washing machine, add detergent, press a button, transfer them to a dryer, and move on. A 1950s household could involve sorting clothing, measuring detergent, loading the machine, transferring clothes, hanging them on a line. And once the morning had properly begun, another series of expectations took over. A 1950s housewife was often expected to know how to make the home feel welcoming without appearing to have worked too hard to achieve it. The ideal atmosphere was effortless. Rooms should look fresh. Meals should seem natural. Children should appear well cared for, and guests should feel comfortable. Yet behind that effortless appearance was constant preparation. Even the curtains could become part of the daily routine. They might be opened in the morning to let sunlight into the rooms and closed later in the evening. Some women washed and starched curtains regularly, especially those in the kitchen where smoke, grease, and cooking odors could collect. Curtains were not simply decoration. They were part of the overall appearance of the home, and anything visibly dusty or stained could make a room look neglected. The same attention could be given to tablecloths. A family might use one during meals and remove it afterward. If food was spilled, the stain had to be dealt with. If the cloth was used for guests, it might receive even more careful treatment. A dining table was not merely a place where food was consumed. It was one of the most visible pieces of the household, and keeping it attractive could be considered part of good housekeeping. Then there was the seemingly endless job of keeping fingerprints away from certain surfaces. Children touched everything. Glass doors, polished furniture, mirrors, windows, and appliances could quickly show evidence of everyday life. A housewife who wanted the home to look immaculate could find herself wiping the same surfaces repeatedly. The mirror was another example. A mirror could be cleaned in the morning and show fingerprints again by afternoon. A polished surface could look perfect at breakfast and slightly dull by evening. The work never stayed finished for long. That was one of the fundamental realities of housekeeping. You could win the battle. You could never permanently win the war. Dust always returned. Laundry always returned. Dishes always returned. And because there was no final victory, the housewife had to accept repetition as part of life. Another expectation involved the careful treatment of floors. Different surfaces required different methods. Wooden floors, linoleum, tile, and rugs could all require different kinds of cleaning. A housewife was expected to know what worked and what could damage a surface. Rugs might need to be beaten, shaken, brushed, or vacuumed. Floors could be swept and mopped. Waxing might be required for certain surfaces. Polishing could make floors shine. A clean floor was not simply cleaner. It looked better. It made the whole room feel more carefully maintained. And floors were among the first things to show the effects of family life. Children ran across them. Shoes carried dirt inside. Pets walked through rooms. Food dropped. Rain created muddy footprints. The housewife could clean the floor in the morning and discover another problem by lunch. This constant cycle made housekeeping physically demanding. Another forgotten task was the care of bedding. Sheets, pillowcases, blankets, and other linens had to be washed and dried. Mattresses might be aired. Blankets could be shaken outside. Pillows needed care. Seasonal bedding might be stored and replaced. A family with several children could generate a surprising amount of linen work, and because beds were expected to look neat, the final arrangement mattered. A beautifully made bed became one of the clearest signs that a room was under control. The same principle applied to closets. A closet was not simply a place where clothes were thrown. Clothing could be arranged according to type or season. Dresses, shirts, coats, and other garments might have designated areas. Shoes could be lined up or stored carefully. A well-organized closet made dressing easier, but maintaining it required attention. As children grew, clothing became too small. As seasons changed, garments needed to be moved. As clothing wore out, it needed repair or replacement. A mother might keep certain clothes because they could be handed down later. She was constantly thinking beyond the present. That kind of planning could extend to household linens too. Towels, sheets, blankets, tablecloths, curtains, and other textiles had to be monitored. A housewife could know exactly which pieces were becoming worn and which ones needed replacing. The household, therefore, had an inventory. She might not have called it an inventory, but she knew what was there. She knew what was missing. She knew what was almost finished. She knew what could wait. That knowledge saved money, and in many families, saving money was considered one of the most important responsibilities of a wife. A woman might be praised for being economical. She could stretch ingredients, reuse clothing, avoid waste, find bargains, repair instead of replacing, make food last, grow vegetables, plan purchases. These were signs of good household management. Being economical did not necessarily mean being poor. It meant being careful. A household that wasted money could quickly become financially unstable. The housewife was expected to prevent that. This could sometimes produce surprisingly creative behavior. A leftover meal could become a completely different dish. Old fabric could become something useful. A worn garment could be altered. An empty jar could become storage. A simple room could be improved with rearrangement, rather than expensive furniture. The ability to make a home feel comfortable without spending heavily was a genuine skill, and women often learned these skills from experience. Another strange expectation involved the appearance of the kitchen itself. The kitchen was where enormous amounts of work happened, but it was still expected to look attractive. Counters needed to be clean, appliances needed to look presentable, dishes needed to be organized, towels needed to be hung neatly, containers needed to be stored. The kitchen had to be both a workplace and a display of cleanliness. This is why kitchen advertisements were so powerful during the period. They did not simply sell appliances, they sold the dream of an organized life. A new refrigerator promised convenience. A new oven promised better cooking. A mixer promised easier baking. A washing machine promised less exhausting laundry. A vacuum cleaner promised a cleaner home with less effort. Each machine was presented as a solution, but the existence of the machine did not eliminate the expectation. The house still had to be clean. The family still needed meals. The clothes still needed washing. The difference was that the tools were becoming more sophisticated. This created an interesting transition between old and modern domestic life. The technology was changing rapidly. The expectations were not changing nearly as quickly. A woman could own an electric appliance and still be judged by traditional standards of housekeeping. If anything, improved technology could sometimes make those standards even higher. If cleaning was supposed to be easier, perhaps the house should be even cleaner. If cooking was supposed to be easier, perhaps meals could be more elaborate. If laundry was supposed to be easier, perhaps clothes could be washed more frequently. Convenience could create new expectations. This is a pattern that appears throughout history. When technology saves time, people do not always use the saved time for rest. Sometimes society simply expects more. Another important part of domestic life was the management of children's schoolwork. A mother might ask whether homework had been completed. She might check notebooks. She could remind children about assignments. She might attend school meetings. She could communicate with teachers. She might make sure children had appropriate supplies. The school system therefore extended into the home. The mother became part of the educational process. If a child struggled academically, she might be expected to notice. If a child behaved badly, she might be contacted. If the school organized an event, she might help. This meant motherhood involved administrative responsibilities as well as emotional ones, and school schedules affected the entire household. Breakfast had to happen at the right time. Clothes had to be ready. Lunch had to be prepared. Transportation had to be organized. Children had to return home. Homework had to be completed. Dinner had to happen around activities. Bedtime had to remain predictable. The school calendar effectively shaped the family calendar. The housewife was often the person connecting the two. Another interesting part of the era was the way children's clothing was sometimes protected from everyday wear. Certain clothes were reserved for school, church, visiting, or special occasions. Play clothes could take the punishment of outdoor activity, while better clothing was kept clean. This made clothing management another strategy for saving money. A good dress was not supposed to be ruined during ordinary play. Children could be told to change before going outside. They might have older clothes for messy activities. The mother was responsible for knowing which clothes were appropriate for which situation. And children did not always understand why. A child might want to wear their favorite outfit to play outside. The mother knew it would become dirty. The argument began. This was another tiny domestic negotiation that happened repeatedly. The housewife was constantly balancing children's desires against practical realities. The same could happen with food. Children wanted sweets. Parents wanted them to eat proper meals. Children wanted to stay awake. Parents wanted them in bed. And there were still more ordinary habits that revealed just how carefully a 1950s household could be controlled. Even the way a family entered and left the home could involve routines that seem surprisingly formal today. Children might be expected to put their belongings in specific places, hang coats properly, remove muddy shoes, and avoid bringing outdoor dirt into the living areas. A husband returning from work might have a familiar place for his coat, hat, briefcase, and shoes. The housewife often knew where everything belonged, and misplaced objects could become another small problem for her to solve. The entrance of the house was especially important because it created the first impression of the family home. A clean doorway, polished floor, tidy coat area, and attractive decorations helped establish the feeling that the household was organized. Even a simple entryway could require regular attention. The front door itself might be cleaned. The windows might be washed. The porch might be swept. Seasonal decorations might be added. Plants might be cared for. And because neighbors could pass by and visitors could arrive unexpectedly, the outside of the house mattered too. A housewife could therefore spend time maintaining not only the interior, but also the visible parts of the property. The garden, porch, windows, and front steps were all part of the home's appearance. Gardening was another activity that could become surprisingly demanding. A well-kept garden was often associated with a respectable home. Flowers could be planted for decoration, while vegetables could provide food. Maintaining a garden required watering, weeding, trimming, planting, and dealing with changing weather. For some women, gardening was a genuine hobby and a welcome escape from indoor chores. For others, it was another responsibility added to an already long list. A vegetable garden could also help reduce grocery costs. Tomatoes, beans, lettuce, herbs, and other produce could supplement what the family purchased. During harvest season, the kitchen could become even busier as fresh produce was cleaned, prepared, cooked, or preserved. The connection between the garden and the kitchen was much stronger than it is in many modern households. Food could begin outside the house and end on the dining table. The woman preparing it might be involved in every stage: growing, picking, washing, cutting, cooking, serving, preserving. The distance between production and consumption was much shorter. Another forgotten responsibility involved caring for household plants. Indoor plants were becoming increasingly popular, and keeping them healthy required regular attention. They needed water, sunlight, pruning, and sometimes repotting. A neglected plant could make a room look untidy. Again, something as simple as a plant could become another small responsibility. The same could apply to pets. Dogs, cats, birds, and other animals were part of many households. Feeding them, cleaning after them, taking care of their needs, and keeping them healthy could become another part of the daily routine. A pet could provide companionship, especially for a woman spending much of the day at home, but companionship came with responsibility. There was always something else that needed attention. Another fascinating part of the 1950s home was the emphasis on protecting furniture. Furniture was valuable, and families often tried to keep it looking new for as long as possible. Children might be told not to jump on sofas. Food was not necessarily allowed everywhere. Certain pieces might be covered or protected. The living room could feel more formal than the modern family room. A beautiful sofa was not necessarily treated as a place where children could throw themselves around. A polished table was not necessarily treated as a surface for toys. The household had rules because possessions were expensive and expected to last. This meant that a housewife could spend time protecting furniture from the people who lived in the house. Covers could be used, surfaces could be polished, stains could be removed, cushions could be straightened, furniture could be rearranged. The home was constantly being preserved. Another unusual habit involved the careful storage of special dishes. Many families had everyday plates and another set reserved for guests or important occasions. The special dishes might only appear during holidays, dinner parties, or formal gatherings. They were washed carefully afterward and returned to storage. This created a distinction between ordinary life and special life. Everyday meals could use ordinary dishes. A holiday dinner deserved something more. A guest deserved something more. The best plates came out. The best glasses came out. The tablecloth came out. The special serving dishes appeared. The housewife knew where everything was stored. She also knew how to clean and protect those items. Some families kept special silverware that required polishing. The process could be time-consuming, but shining silver was associated with elegance and good housekeeping. A formal dinner could therefore involve not only cooking, but also preparing objects that had been stored for months. The dining table became a display of domestic competence, and the hostess was expected to understand how to arrange it. Where should the forks go? Where should the knives go? Where should the glasses be placed? Which serving dishes should be used? Which food should be served first? How should guests be seated? These details might sound unnecessarily complicated now, but etiquette mattered. A woman who knew how to host a formal dinner could be considered socially accomplished. Another strange expectation was that the hostess should pay attention to conversation, while simultaneously managing the practical details of the meal. She might be serving food, checking on children, noticing whether guests needed more coffee, and still participating in conversation. She was expected to be present and invisible at the same time. She had to make guests comfortable without constantly drawing attention to the work she was doing. This is another form of performance. A good hostess made hospitality look natural. She did not appear stressed. She did not complain about the work. She did not make guests feel guilty for creating extra dishes. She simply kept everything moving. Afterward, she cleaned everything. This pattern occurred repeatedly in domestic social life. Another interesting detail was the importance of handwritten invitations for certain occasions. A birthday party, shower, wedding, related gathering, or holiday event could involve carefully prepared invitations. The invitation itself communicated formality. The guest was expected to respond. The hostess needed to know how many people were coming. Food had to be planned accordingly. Seating had to be considered. The house had to be prepared. The number of guests affected everything. This meant the simple act of inviting people into the home could trigger a chain of planning. The housewife became an event coordinator without calling herself one. She had to estimate quantities. She had to organize timing. She had to consider what children would do. She had to prepare enough food. She had to ensure there were enough chairs. She had to think about parking. She had to make sure the bathroom was clean. And she had to remain pleasant throughout the event. The family might remember the gathering as a wonderful evening. The hostess might remember the work involved. Another important aspect of the era was the use of handwritten thank you notes after receiving gifts or hospitality. These notes were not necessarily optional for every situation. Social etiquette placed value on expressing gratitude properly. A woman might keep a supply of stationery specifically for these occasions. She could write notes on behalf of children who were too young to write themselves. She might remind them to thank relatives for gifts. She might help them form the correct words. This meant mothers were also teaching social communication. They were training children to understand gratitude, politeness, and social responsibility. A thank You note was more than a message. It was a lesson in manners, and the lesson began early. Another responsibility involved maintaining contact with extended family. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and distant relatives might not live nearby, but relationships had to be maintained intentionally. Letters were written, telephone calls were made, cards were sent, visits were planned. The housewife could become the person who remembered all these relationships. If a relative had a birthday, she knew. If someone was sick, she might call. If a family member moved, she updated the address. If a holiday was approaching, she remembered who needed a card. The family's social network often depended on her memory. This is another reason the housewife's role extended beyond physical labor. She maintained relationships, she kept people connected, she remembered things that others forgot. And because these responsibilities were not always visible, they could be easy to underestimate. Another strange habit involved the careful handling of money when shopping. A woman might carry cash, checks, or other forms of payment and mentally track how much she had spent. There was no banking application displaying the household balance instantly. Receipts had to be kept. Household expenses might be recorded manually. Bills arrived in physical envelopes. Payments were made by mail, in person, or through other traditional methods. The household budget therefore required more active management. A housewife might sit at a table with bills, receipts, and a notebook, calculating what could be spent. This was not necessarily glamorous work,